Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Welcome back to the podcast. In today's solo episode, I want to go over some factors to consider if you feel that your training isn't progressing. First off, a fundamental factor is the definition of the concept of progress in and of itself. Most people think of progress as either adding more weight to your exercises or more repetitions, but that's an excessively narrow definition of progress because your reps and the load that you're using could also stay the same, but your form is getting better over time. That's also a form of progress because it means that you're able to hit the target muscle or target muscles more and more effectively as your form improves. Moreover, with bodyweight exercises, a form of progress would be to change from an easier variation to a harder variation. For example, maybe you start with hands elevated push-ups from a chair, and then you progress to floor push-ups. That is the equivalent of adding more weight. So it's certainly another form of progress. A final form of progress is the ability to hit higher and higher intensities of effort. Pushing yourself close enough to failure to build muscle effectively is freaking hard. And we all tend to have some mental barriers that can prevent us from hitting those higher intensities. And typically, if you're more of a beginner, these barriers present themselves a little bit sooner. So when you're a little bit further away from failure during a set, because you haven't yet trained your mind to be able to push past those barriers. And this is something that I see a lot with my newer clients who haven't been training for a long time, or maybe they have been training for a few months, but they've never really been exposed to the concept of intensity of effort. When I start working with them, I ask for technique videos to assess their form. And once I establish that their form is solid, I also start giving them advice on intensity of effort. And more often than not, I know I drive them up the wall because they will write down on their program RPE 8 or 9 or whatever RPE target they believe they've hit. And then I watch their video and I'm telling them, I think you had like several reps before hitting this intensity of effort that you thought you hit. And this is simply because you genuinely think you are training hard, but you haven't trained your mind to achieve that intensity of effort. So while you think you've trained hard, your muscles could actually push a little bit harder, but your brain believes that you can't. So you need to learn to tell the difference between what your brain is suggesting and what your muscles can actually do. And that's another form of progress. Another factor to consider is, have you actually stopped making progress? Because sometimes I find that people will think they're not making progress if they've had one bad workout. And they'll be in a bad mood for the rest of the day, several days, even a week, because of that one bad workout. Now, a bad workout doesn't mean that you're not making progress. It's a one-off circumstance. You're not making progress when there's a pattern of consistent performance plateau or regression. If it's a single bad workout, we all have them. And it sucks. I love training and I absolutely hate when I have a bad workout. But I also recognize that it's one bad workout and I can choose to be pissed about it and think that I'm not making progress and ban my training program and tell my coach, I'm not doing this anymore. Or I can wait until the next session and try to figure out if this is a pattern, if all of my sessions in that week were actually really subpar, or if it was just a one off. A third factor to consider is how often you can expect to add more reps or more weight to the bar. And that heavily depends on your experience. You might have heard that resistance training is defined as a game of diminishing returns. And if there was a video, you'd be seeing me making air quotes. Just imagine that I'm making air quotes here. What that means is that when you start out, you're going to be able to add reps and or weight to the bar relatively often, even workout to workout in many cases. However, the more experience you accumulate, the slower those gains come by. It doesn't necessarily mean that the program isn't working or that you're doing something wrong. It might simply mean that you're maybe comparing your current rate of progress to the rate of progress that you could achieve when you were less experienced with training. So you need to adjust your expectations. Not only that, but there are also lifestyle factors and training factors that you want to take into account in order to set yourself realistic expectations for progress. In terms of lifestyle factors, a bit of an obvious one is your health status. You can't compare your training sessions when you're not feeling well to your training sessions when your health status is your norm. If you're a little bit under the weather or you've just recovered from an illness, your workouts aren't going to be your best performance. And if you find that you're plateauing a little bit or perhaps regressing on a couple of lifts, if you're plateauing and you're not feeling your best, I would be patient and wait to ride the illness out or give yourself a few days after you've recovered from the illness so that you can start to feel a little bit better. If you're actually regressing and you still have that illness, I would consider whether you should maybe take some time away from the gym. Generally, when somebody doesn't feel well, if they have symptoms that affect them above the neck, so we're talking a bit of a stuffy nose or a bit of a headache, I would say you could train. But if the symptoms affect your whole body or affect the body below the neck, so I'm talking chills, a fever, a chesty cough, fatigue, and I mean a relatively high level of fatigue where you're definitely more tired and you're struggling to get on with your normal everyday activities, then I would advise against training until you're over the worst of these symptoms and you're either fully recovered or at the very least you only have symptoms above the neck. The point being, if your health status is different, if you're transitioning from an illness back to full health, or if you're still ill, then you can't expect to be making the exact same progress as you would under normal circumstances. So you want to give yourself more time to recover, and you might even want to consider taking some time without training at all. Other than your health status, your sleep quality, your stress levels, and your mood can also affect your training performance on any given day. Not to mention whether and how much you ate and drank before the session. If you had a meal or a snack and enough fluids before training, you're going to perform very differently than if you were very busy and you didn't manage to. Your nutritional status can actually affect your performance from one phase to the next. For example, if you spend a training phase in a calorie deficit, your performance isn't going to be the same as if you were to spend that same phase in a surplus or at maintenance calories. So if you're completing a fat loss phase and then you enter a maintenance phase or a surplus, then you can expect that your performance is going to likely improve simply because you have more energy available coming in from food or less energy that you're expending on exercise like cardio and steps or a combination of the two. If you're somebody who menstruates, your menstrual cycle could affect your training performance. For example, what I typically see in my clients with a cycle is that in the first 2 weeks after their periods, that's when their performance is likely to be at a peak. Whereas in the final 2 weeks, it may become a little bit harder to maintain the same performance at the same intensity of effort. However, it's very important to note that the menstrual cycle is very, very personal. So every individual tends to have a slightly different response. There are people who menstruate who actually don't notice any difference at all, and people for whom each week in their cycle feels completely different. And then there are other people still who find themselves somewhere in between these two extremes. That's why with my clients who menstruate, I ask to track their menstrual cycle if they're comfortable with that, so that I can help them figure out, first and foremost, if there is a pattern and if they have any particular responses to a week in their cycle versus another week. And finally, if there are different responses, then together we can plan to make the most of every single week. In summary, when you're comparing your performance to assess if you're making progress or not, you need to compare apples to apples. And you only need to worry about, in quotes, bad performance if it becomes a pattern, not if it's a one off because you didn't sleep very well or because you had a really stressful day at work. As for training factors, you need to consider whether the exercise you're doing is new or old. Because when you do a completely new exercise or an exercise that you've done before, but that you haven't done for a few training blocks or phases or mesocycles, you're going to likely make faster progress than if you'd been doing the same exercise for several weeks or months. If the exercise is completely new, then what happens is that you're undergoing neuromuscular adaptations in the initial weeks when you're introducing the new lift. Neuromuscular adaptations is a fancy term that refers to how your nervous system learns to recruit your muscle fibers in the right order to perform a certain exercise. In essence, when you are introducing a new lift for the first time, your nervous system is like Bambi on ice. It doesn't know where to start. Oh my god, do I start with these muscle fibers or with these other fibers? And how many do I need to recruit? Do I need a little bit? Do I need all of them? How do I do this? And over time, it gets better and better at recruiting the right number of fibers in the right order for you to perform that exercise. And that's why in this initial phase, you can make progress relatively fast. Once the neuromuscular adaptations are over, then your gains automatically slow down. Your ability to make progress with that exercise slows down. Similarly, if you haven't done the exercise for a certain period of time, even if you were already familiar with it, you've lost some of those neuromuscular adaptations. In other words, it's a little bit like your nervous system has kind of forgotten how to do the exercise, but much like they say that once you learn how to ride a bike, it's very easy to pick it up again. It's also true that your nervous system is going to readapt readapt faster to an old exercise that you haven't done in a while than it adapts to a completely new exercise. So if you're reintroducing an exercise after a few months, you can expect slightly faster gains than normal, but these are usually short-lived. Maybe it will be for the first few workouts or maybe the first week or two. Whereas if the exercise is completely new, you could go for 3, 4, 5, even 6 weeks and still see relatively fast progress. Another training factor to take into account is exercise and session order. You could be doing the exact same exercise. However, if it's now in a different order within the session, maybe it's the third exercise instead of the first. Or maybe it's in the same place within the session, but now the session comes later in the week or earlier in the week. These changes the response that your body is going to have to this exercise. because if you're fresher, you're going to be less fatigued. So you might find yourself performing a little bit better than in a previous training phase. Whereas if the exercise now comes later in a session or later in the training week, then you're not as fresh, you're more fatigued. So now this will affect your performance negatively, but it doesn't mean you're not making progress. Again, it's a case of comparing apples to apples rather than apples to oranges. The next factor I want to cover is your intensity of efforts. You're not going to make progress if you don't push yourself hard enough. You can be very consistent, you can have perfect form, you can literally be doing everything right, but if you're not pushing yourself to the right intensity of effort, you are not going to build muscle as efficiently as you could. You're going to build some muscle, but it won't be at the most efficient rate. If you want to learn more about what I mean by intensity of effort, I recorded at least 3 podcasts going into depth about this. There's episode 62 with Dr. Eric Helms and episode 23 with Martin Refalo on the concept of proximity to failure and its relationship with muscle growth. And there's also a solo episode that I recorded a year ago at this point, which was episode 9, in which I covered what the rating of perceived exertion scale is. And that's a scale that you can use to gauge your intensity of effort and to make sure that you're training hard enough. So take a look at those episodes or give them a listen if you haven't already. But if you're already familiar with the concept of intensity of effort and you don't think that you're making progress, it could be that you're getting complacent. It could be that you're going through the motions. For example, I was talking about this recently with a client. When you get used to a certain intensity of effort, however high that might be, you could subconsciously start to try less hard. For instance, in this client's particular case, his intensity of effort that I programmed for him was failure on every single set. And I was watching one of his technique videos one week and I told him, hey, you reported that this was a set done to failure, and I can see that you tried a rep and stopped halfway through, but it seems like a bit of a half hearted effort. So I challenged him to try to distinguish between mental failure and physical failure. And these are two concepts that I made up. So you won't necessarily find them in the scientific literature. But what I mean by mental failure is when you are failing because you're subconsciously pulling back. You're thinking, well, last week I got 15 reps, this week I got 16. It's very hard, so I'll just stop. You're not telling yourself you want to stop, but you're not pushing as hard as you could. You're getting to that final rep that's very hard, and you fail it because you simply don't put a lot of effort into it. Whereas if you really were trying, you would squeeze out a complete repetition instead of failing it. And that's what I would call mental failure. Whereas physical failure is when you're actually trying as hard as you possibly fucking can and you're simply not getting that extra rep. And don't get me wrong, I wasn't talking to my client from a high horse or anything. I brought this up in his check-in feedback because within the same month, I'd noticed that I was doing that. My coach was programming failure training for me on the majority of my exercises. And at that point, I'd spent at least 8 weeks in the same training phase. And I noticed that sometimes I wasn't pushing all the way to failure. I was failing the rep, but it was because my brain was pulling back a little bit. I wasn't necessarily trying as hard as I could. So technically, it was still around RPE 9 or 10. And then I was just stopping my attempts at trying and I would fail the rep. But it wasn't real failure in that my muscles could have pushed for more. It was my brain that basically decided to chicken out. So that's something that you want to consider. And in some cases, it might even be a sign that you might need a deload. There are several indicators that one might need a deload, and I would normally wait to see a few of them arise before I take a client through a deload. For example, with this client, the fact that he was achieving mental failure rather than physical failure was literally the only sign that he might need a deload. And the rest of his feedback was absolutely fine. So I didn't suggest a deload for him in that particular phase. But for myself, on the other hand, the fact that I was subconsciously pulling back my training intensity was the first sign that I needed a deload, because then a couple of weeks later I got more indicators to suggest that I needed one. I was very mentally fatigued. I was no longer making progress at the same rate for more than one session. I was losing motivation to train, which is very unlike me because I love training. And I also unfortunately injured myself, which was very short lived, fortunately. So, after this unexpected tangent I went on about deloads, let's circle back to the story that I was telling you about my client. Once I gave him the advice to try to distinguish between mental failure and physical failure, he came back to me next week and said, "You know, at first I was slightly offended." Those were his words exactly, and I wanted to quote him because it made me cackle when I read that in his check in. "I was slightly offended that you would think that I wouldn't train hard enough. But then this week, I actually followed your suggestion and I ended up squeezing out a couple of reps on many exercises." So here are the two main learning points from this story. Learning point number one, I am always right. Learning point number two, it happens to the best of us. We can all become complacent with our training intensity. And if that's what's happening to you, that may well be the reason why you feel that your training hasn't been progressing. Now, if you've gone through all of these different factors and you still believe that you're not making progress, then the underlying reason may be that you're either not doing enough or that you're doing too much. And when I say not enough or too much, I mean that you may not be doing enough in terms of intensity of effort and or volume. And I've already covered your intensity of effort. It's basically your proximity to failure, whereas volume is the number of hard, challenging sets taken close enough to failure that you're performing for a muscle group every week or over a period of time. Normally, I think of volume as weekly volume. Importantly, you need to find the right balance between these two to where you're pushing yourself very hard, but you can still recover from it. Because if you're not pushing yourself enough, then you're not going to see a lot of progress. But if you're literally burying yourself under a lot of intensity and a lot of volume and you're not recovering, you're also not going to see a lot of progress. Intensity of effort and volume are also very closely related in that when you increase the intensity of effort, you may not be able to do the same amount of volume because now you're no longer able to recover. Vice versa, if you increase your volume, you may not be able to push to the same intensity of efforts because, again, you're no longer able to recover. I can't tell you how much volume and how much intensity is good for you because it's very individual dependent, but it's also very situation dependent. In that, for one person, training 5 days a week with 15 to 20 sets per muscle group may be absolutely fine and actually perfect for them to make progress. But for you, it might be too much. And for another person, it might actually be not enough. They need more volume in order to see more progress. However, for the same person for whom these 15 to 20 sets spread across 5 days per week is perfect at this particular point in time, this same exact volume with the same exact distribution over 5 days may become too much in a different phase of their life. For example, if they are in a calorie surplus, they have plenty of energy coming in from food and they're not excessively fatigued because they're doing a bunch of steps or a bunch of cardio to lose body fat, then 5 days per week, 15 to 20 sets at a relatively high intensity of effort could be perfectly fine. Then they enter a deficit, they increase their steps, they add in some cardio, they lower their calories, and at that point they realize, oh man, this is destroying me now. And that's actually what I found with a client of mine a few months ago. He was training very, very consistently and really loving his program, which was a 5-day program. And he was in a muscle building phase and he was in a surplus. Then his goal was to go into a fat loss phase over the summer, not necessarily for the summer, but he wanted to lose some body fat. So when we transitioned into a deficit and we were a few weeks into it, we realized that he was no longer recovering as well. He was struggling to find the motivation to train. He didn't have as much energy. He was struggling with more hunger than would be expected at that particular stage in his fat loss phase. And as soon as I changed this program and we lowered the frequency to 4 days per week, which is essentially a way to lower your volume, because if you're training one fewer day, you're also doing fewer sets per muscle group. Then all of a sudden, it was like he came back to life. He was making PBs again. He was super happy. Oh, PB means personal best, by the way, not peanut butter, although that would be awesome. Anyway, he was getting great results again. And so that's proof that for him, 5 days per week at that volume, at that particular intensity of effort was fine at maintenance calories and in a surplus, but it simply wasn't sustainable in a deficit relative to how busy he was in the rest of his life at the time and relative to the demands of the calorie deficit in terms of how many steps, how much cardio I asked him to do, and how low his food had to go to achieve his goal. So, hopefully, this gives you some insight into the factors that you want to take into account if you think that you're not seeing the progress that you would expect with a certain exercise or with your program as a whole. Thank you so much for listening. And if you're still frustrated with your program and you don't know what's wrong and you would like a little bit of guidance and a little bit of support to make the most of training and nutrition and get the best results that you can, I'm currently taking on clients. So you can find more information about my online coaching service by clicking on my website link in the notes below, where you'll also find a link to my application form, which you can fill out, and I'll get back to you within 72 hours in order to book you in for a consultation, assuming that your application form passed my initial screening, of course. Other than that, in the notes, you'll also find the links to the episodes that I referenced earlier, as well as links to my social media platforms and to all the other ways in which you can connect with me. And I would really love if you wanted to, or if you wanted to share this episode with somebody that you know who would really benefit from it. It's thanks to people doing that the podcast can keep growing, and I really, really appreciate it. To finish off, thank you for your time, and until next time. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.